Lord Biggar, Professor Nigel Biggar, he burst into public consciousness with his 2023 book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning.
You cannot say the British Empire was evil. British had been involved in slave trading and slavery, but it's also true the British were among the first people to abolish slave trading and slavery.
The premise was simple. The critics of the British Empire, he argued, have overstated its vices and ignored its many virtues.
Indians had good reason to cooperate with the East India Company because it was in their interests.
There was constant civil wars among Indians, and one of the effects of the expansion of the East India Company was peace in India. French people don't refer to London as London, they talk about Londres, so why can't we talk about Bombay rather than Mumbai? It is a kind of attempt to pretend that the British did nothing to build India. India as it now exists, and indeed Bombay, Madras and Calcutta as they now exist, would not exist were it not for the British.
And what followed was an extraordinary tour of public debate. He was interviewed on Al Jazeera and most recently on the Heretics podcast with Andrew Gold, in which Lord Biggar set out to correct the record. And correct it he did, though perhaps not in the way he intended.
You can't bring yourself to just say, this was really bad.
Page 276, you will find a whole list of the bad things which the British Empire presided.
And every time someone criticizes you, say, look at page 276. It's like your one page out of 400 pages where you list all the crimes, and it's your go-to move to say page 276.
And it's the skill of never actually answering a question. What you find is not a towering defense of imperial nuance. What you find is a 43-count audit trail of argumentative failure. This is a man doing the rhetorical equivalent of speedrunning the entire history of human wrongdoing to avoid discussing any single instance of it. At some point, the complexity is not a feature of the situation. The complexity is the defense strategy. When the apparatus of academic prestige is deployed not to illuminate but to obscure, it is not merely a debate technique, it is a form of harm. This is a craft. It takes years of practice. You do not simply wake up one morning and begin deflecting with the casual elegance of a man who's clearly deflected many times before. I'm speaking, of course, about the Emeritus Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at Oxford University. And he's a man I shall refer to throughout this monologue as Lord Biggar, partly out of a certain ironic generosity, and partly because if you're going to spend your intellectual career defending the largest empire in human history, you might as well dress the part. So, let us begin. Before we get to the violations themselves, let me explain how this works, because Lord Biggar does not commit his evasions randomly. They follow a pattern. They form, if you will, a curriculum. So we identified, across both debates, 5 primary techniques. And these are not obscure rhetorical devices buried in philosophy journals. They're as familiar as a leaky tap, and about as useful. The first technique is Whataboutery. This is also known in formal logic as the tu quoque, Latin for but you also. So this is the argumentative equivalent of responding to a parking ticket by pointing out that somewhere in the city someone is committing armed robbery. Technically it's true, but it's entirely irrelevant. Technique 2, the straw man. You take your opponent's actual argument, quietly replace it with a much weaker, much sillier version that nobody actually made, and then defeat that version with great fanfare, declare victory, and hope that nobody noticed the switcheroo.
The argument made by the critics is British Empire was essentially evil, and I say no, it wasn't. It was a mixture of good and bad.
I think that's a straw man. A lot of historians of empire do not say essentially evil.
Technique 3, minimization. You acknowledge that, yes, something bad happened, but then you immediately pivot to cataloguing all the reasons it wasn't quite as bad as people say, citing 2 or 3 redeeming features with the energy of a man writing his own TripAdvisor review. Technique 4, appeal to complexity. When asked a direct moral question, you sigh deeply, you tilt your head, and explain that the matter is really far more nuanced than a simple yes or no can accommodate.
So we can condemn what happened in Kenya as an evil stain on British history as part of the empire.
Well, it depends what you mean, but
the torture of people in the Bagh.
This is, of course, sometimes true in scholarship, but in debate, when it's deployed every single time a difficult question arrives, it functions less as a philosophical position and more as a fire exit. Technique 5, deflection via personal independence. When confronted with an uncomfortable association, say speaking at a conference platform linked to a European authoritarian government, you do not address the institutional question. You simply assert that you are a free-thinking individual, you pivot to something else, and trust that the audience will not notice that the question remains entirely unanswered. These 5 techniques, deployed with considerable skill, and one must acknowledge remarkable stamina, across 2 long-form debates, account for the overwhelming majority of Lord Biggar's 43 documented violations. So, let's look at them up close. We begin with the crown jewel, the technique Lord Biggar reaches for more than any other, the one that opens the very first exchange of the Al Jazeera debate, like a man walking through the door already holding his excuses. The interviewer has barely finished introducing him, barely sketched the contours of the question, when Lord Biggar deploys what I can only describe as a preemptive whataboutery. Before any specific charge has even been laid, he establishes that empire and slavery and racism are universal phenomena practiced in every continent by people of every skin colour. Now, technically, this is not wrong, but notice what it does. It removes from the outset any possibility of holding a specific institution, the British Empire, to a specific standard of moral scrutiny. If anyone did it, then criticising anyone in particular becomes, by implication, a kind of unfairness, a selective prosecution. This is the argumentative equivalent of a chef caught serving raw chicken to his diners, who then calmly explains that foxes also kill chickens, seagulls steal chips, and besides, some people eat sushi. All true, not even slightly relevant to the chicken on the plate. But then Lord Biggar doesn't stop there. Throughout the debate, when the conversation turns to racism within the empire, he points to racism among Arab slave traders, racism in other empires, racism in Gandhi, yes, Gandhi, and racism in 20th century China. This is a man doing the rhetorical equivalent of speedrunning the entire history of human wrongdoing to avoid discussing any single instance of it. And when the interviewer, Mehdi Hassan, challenges him on this technique, when he says quite reasonably, "You're engaging in whataboutery," Lord Biggar does something I find genuinely extraordinary. Rather than defending the method, rather than explaining why the comparison is analytically useful, rather than merely evasive, he simply asks, "What's wrong with whataboutery?" This is a complete reversal of the burden of proof. The challenger is expected to justify the criticism. The person deploying the questionable method is not expected to defend it. It is like a student caught plagiarizing, who responds to the accusation not by explaining themselves, but by asking, calmly, with one eyebrow slightly raised, what exactly is wrong with copying? This is not a debate tactic. This is an escape hatch presented as a philosophical position. But perhaps the most spectacular use of the whataboutery in the first debate, the moment I keep returning to, is the Opium Wars exchange. Lord Biggar is pressed on whether Britain's deliberate enforcement of opium addiction upon the Chinese was morally defensible, and his response is to introduce the fact that Mao Zedong later killed millions of people. Chairman Mao, who was born in 1893, who came to power in 1949, in response to a question about events in the 1840s. So I'd like you to sit with that for a moment. A builder sued for constructing a wall so badly that it collapsed and injured the homeowner defends himself in court by pointing out that an earthquake later leveled the entire neighborhood. The neighbor's injuries are, by implication, contextualized into insignificance. This is not history, this is not nuance, this is a red herring wearing a mortarboard. The formal verdict on that exchange, in our analysis, was the only fallacious response of the entire first debate. One, and it was this one, because this is not merely a weak or evasive response, it contains a named, identifiable, logical fallacy. It introduces information that is entirely irrelevant to the moral evaluation being requested. Let me say that again, because it is worth dwelling on. In the more hostile debate, Lord Biggar violated the rules of debate in 24% of his defensive responses. In the friendlier conversation, where the interviewer is not trying to defeat him, where the environment is collegial and relaxed, that figure rises to almost 40%. So what does that tell us? It tells us that pressure produces a certain discipline. Removing the pressure, and what emerges is the undiluted method. The Heretics debate is in many ways the purest specimen, and the dominant technique in that conversation is the straw man. Again and again, when critics of the British Empire are described, Lord Biggar attributes to them a position that the most cursory familiarity with the actual literature would reveal they do not hold.
You said the British Empire was not Nazi Germany, but it's a very low bar to say we were not the Nazis.
But there was nothing akin to the massively racist, genocidal intent.
Specifically, he characterises critics as claiming that the British Empire was entirely, uniquely evil, extraordinarily sui generis in its wickedness. This is not what mainstream post-colonial scholarship actually claims. It is not what the historians who have challenged his book claim. What they claim, and this is considerably harder to refute, which is presumably why Lord Biggar does not attempt to refute it, is that the empire caused disproportionate harm, deployed racialized violence, extracted enormous wealth, and has been inadequately reckoned with. These are specific, evidenced claims. They do not require the empire to be uniquely evil. They require it to be specifically harmful. By replacing that argument with the claim that critics say Britain was uniquely bad, Lord Biggar can then deploy the perfectly correct observation that other empires also did terrible things, which is true, and which is also, in this context, completely irrelevant and beside the point. Imagine a football manager told by his board that the team's passing accuracy was poor last season, summons the full force of his analytical powers, and delivers a passionate defence of the proposition that his team is not the worst passing team in the history of football. Nobody claimed they were. The actual problem remains entirely unaddressed. The manager has won an argument that nobody started. This is the straw man, and in the Heretics debate, Lord Biggar builds it, dresses it, introduces it as the other side, and demolishes it repeatedly with considerable energy and evident satisfaction. Part 5. I'd like to turn to the next violation, complexity as a fire exit. So I want to spend a moment on the appeal to complexity because it's the most insidious of Lord Biggar's techniques, and the most easily mistaken for genuine intellectual rigour. When the interviewer, Andrew Gold, asks him directly, was the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh, Amritsar 1919, where General Dyer ordered the shooting of hundreds of unarmed civilians, including children, in an enclosed space with no exit, was that wrong? Lord Biggar does not say yes, he does not say no. He said it's more complicated than that. He invokes the context. He mentions that Dyer believed there was an insurgency. He qualifies it. He nuances. He complexifies. Now I want to be scrupulously fair here. Historical context is legitimate. Scholarship requires nuance. And I'm not saying that complexity is never real. What I am saying is this. When a man deploys the appeal to complexity in response to every single direct moral question put to him, Jallianwala Bagh, the Bengal famine, the Irish famine, the economics of extraction, when the appeal to complexity functions not as an analytical tool, but as a reliable, repeatable mechanism for avoiding a verdict, it has ceased to be scholarship, and it has become what I can only describe as a bureaucratic alibi. Imagine a doctor asked whether it was medically appropriate to give a patient a treatment that caused them serious harm, who then responds, well, medicine is an enormously complex field. and the history of pharmacology contains many examples of treatments whose effects were not fully understood at the time, and one must be careful not to apply contemporary standards to historical practice. And furthermore, other doctors have also made difficult decisions, and the patient, meanwhile, is lying on the floor. At some point, the complexity is not a feature of the situation. The complexity is the defence strategy. And Lord Biggar, to his credit, has refined this strategy to a genuinely impressive level of polish. The analysis of the second debate identified this tactic appearing no fewer than 4 separate times as the primary mechanism for avoiding a direct moral verdict. 4 times in a single 60-minute conversation. That is not nuance, that is armour. The 6th violation. Let me close with what I consider the most revealing exchange of the second debate, and the one that in many ways illuminates the entire project. Andrew Gold raises the fact that Lord Biggar has appeared at forums and platforms associated with the Hungarian government of Viktor Orbán, a government which has, to put it with academic restraint, a somewhat complicated relationship with the free exchange of ideas. And the question's not unreasonable. The question is, does Lord Biggar consider that lending his academic prestige to such platforms is appropriate? Does it give him pause? And Lord Biggar's response is not to engage with the institutional question. It is to assert, with some vigour, that he is his own man, that he thinks for himself, that he is not responsible for who else attends a conference or who funds a platform, all of which may well be true. But the question was not about his personal intellectual independence. The question was about the legitimacy of the platform, and those are 2 entirely different things. A ventriloquist dummy, asked whether it endorses everything the ventriloquist believes, indignantly insists that it has its own opinions. It speaks in its own voice, and objects strongly to the implication of any intellectual dependency. The question of who controls the hand inside remains unexplored. This is evasion in its purest form, not deflection toward a related topic, not an appeal to complexity, simply a refusal to answer the question that was asked, disguised as an answer to a question that was not asked. 43 violations across 2 debates. So let me clear about what this is and what it is not. This is not a claim that Lord Biggar is unintelligent. He is not unintelligent. And this is not a claim that every position he holds is wrong. Some of his historical observations are perfectly accurate. This is not even a claim that he acts in bad faith, though I confess that questions become harder to answer the more carefully one reads the transcripts. What these 43 violations represent is something considerably more important than a simple catalogue of rhetorical failures. What this is evidence of a pattern, a systematic, sustained, remarkably consistent pattern of deflecting moral accountability away from a specific institution by universalizing its crimes, minimizing its specific harms, refusing direct verdicts on documented atrocities, and repositioning every critic as an ideological zealot, whose argument can be dismissed by defeating a version of it that the critic never actually made. And this pattern matters because it is not unique to Lord Biggar. It is in fact the standard operating procedure of Imperial revisionism everywhere. The playbook is the same, whether it appears in a Fox News segment, a Tory conference speech, or an Oxford ethics lecture. Change the accent, but keep the methods. Dharma teaches us that Satya, truth, reality, is not merely a philosophical concept, it's a structural principle. The universe is built on the correspondence between what is and what is said to be. When that correspondence is systematically disrupted, when the apparatus of academic prestige is deployed not to illuminate but to obscure, it is not merely a debate technique, it is a form of harm, a quiet, well footnoted, professionally credentialed form of harm. Lord Biggar has a book, a platform, and a formidable talent for not answering questions. Until next time, this is Pandit Satish K. Sharma for Theopolitica. Thank you for listening.